Welcome to Wheelock's Latin Chapter 30. In this chapter, we're going to be continuing our look at the subjunctive mood. We have already looked at the subjunctive mood, the present system, but now we're going to move into the perfect system, the perfect tense and pluperfect tense. We're also going to be looking at a new use of the subjunctive, the indirect question, and then we're also going to be looking at sequence of tenses. Let's jump into a quick review of the subjunctive present tense, or the present system that we've already learned. All right, both active and passive voice in the subjunctive mood and the present system. This is a chart of what that has looked like as we have studied it. If you'll remember that the present tense in the singular, we have the vowel shift that we make use of. We're going to take the present stem. We're going to shift the vowel based on this mnemonic device, he beat a giant. So first conjugation verbs will shift from an A to an E in the connecting vowel or the vowel stem. The second conjugation verbs will shift from an E to an EA. Third conjugation shift to an A. And fourth and third IO will shift to an IA. And of course, to these, you will add the present tense endings for or I should say the active present tense endings, MST, must, int, and of course for passive you will add the passive endings, are, rist, ter, mer, many, inter. So that's the present system, and here's the present tense and the imperfect tense. We're going to basically take the active present infinitive and add our present endings for active voice. So MST, must, int. And of course we mentioned or learned already that there is no future tense in the subjunctive mood, because by definition the subjunctive mood is the potential or hypothetical action and has a sense of futurity already to it. Now, there we go. Now, for the passive voice, again, same exact system as the active. We just substitute the passive endings, are, rist, ter, mer, many, inter. But again, present tense stem plus the vowel shift according to this mnemonic device, he beat a giant. Now passive endings, are, rist, ter, mer, many, inter. And then for the imperfect tense, again, we'll take the active present infinitive plus our passive endings, are, rist, ter, mer, many, inter. And again, of course, in the passive voice, no future tense. So that's a quick review. Let's now look at the active and passive voice subjunctive mood for the perfect system. And again, all conjugations will operate according to these systems or this principle we're about to look at. So here's the chart. For the perfect tense, we're going to use the perfect stem. Now, if you remember, in indicative mood, for the perfect tense, we use the perfect stem. Third principal part, drop the ending. So again, for like lado, ladari, ladawi, ladatum, ladawi, L-A-U-D-A-V-I, drop that I ending, which is your perfect first person singular ending, and that leaves you the stem, L-A-U-D-A-V, ladaw. And so you take that stem, and to that stem, we're going to add the infix eri, eri, and then we'll add our present tense endings, mst, must, int. So you could simplify that by simply saying perfect stem plus erim, plus oris, plus orit, oremus, oritis, orent. I like to break it down just a little bit for us. So that's the perfect tense in the subjunctive mood, active voice. Pluperfect tense. Now, if you remember, we just said that the imperfect uses the active present infinitive. Well, the pluperfect is going to be very similar, but here we're going to use the active perfect infinitive, not the active present, but the active perfect infinitive, again, plus our endings, mst, must, tis, int. We'll look at what this looks like in the actual form here in just a minute. And again, of course, no future perfect, just as there is no future tense in the subjunctive mood. Now, what about passive voice? Well, passive voice, we're going to, just like in the indicative mood for the passive system, perfect system in the passive voice, we use the fourth principal part plus a form of sum. Well, we're going to do the exact same thing here. We're going to use the fourth principal part plus the subjunctive form of sum. So sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sent. So it's pretty straightforward. It's just like you've learned before. We're just going to shift the form of sum into a subjunctive form. Now for pluperfect, again, we use the fourth principal part, and we're going to use the infinitive esse. Esse, this is, again, pluperfect is going to want to lean towards using, just like the imperfect, using the infinitive. Well, here we're going to use the infinitive esse, the to be verb, plus again our endings, present tense, mst, mustis, nt. And again, of course, no passive, no future perfect in the passive voice. So let's see what all this looks like in practice. We're going to take the first conjugation paradigm verb, lado, ladari, ladawi, ladatum. And as we mentioned a minute ago, we're going to take that stem, ladaw, and we're going to drop it in there to the perfect tense. This is perfect active voice. And we're going to add the ERI plus our present endings, MST, mustis, nt. So we end up with ladawarim, ladawararis, ladawarit, ladawarimus, ladawaritis, ladawarint. I may have praised, you may have praised, he may have praised, etc. Now keep in mind, this translation that I'm giving you here for the subjunctive is rarely actually used, because subjunctives are most frequently used in different kinds of clauses, secondary clauses like purpose and result clauses we've learned so far. We'll learn others here in the forthcoming chapters. And rarely are they translated with this may or might that we're about to see here in the pluperfect tense. So you really need to learn how to translate subjunctive based on the type of clause it's in. But just to give us a little bit of a translation, we'll go ahead and have this in place. I may have praised, etc. Now for the pluperfect, again, third principal part, but to this we're going to add isse, I-S-S-E. Now if you remember, ladawisi is the perfect active infinitive. Perfect active infinitive is the third principal part plus isse. So we're going to grab that, ladawisi, and we're going to add our mst, mustisent. So we end up with ladawisim, ladawises, ladawiset, ladawisemus, ladawisetis, ladawisent. And this is the pluperfect. So perfect active infinitive plus endings. In translation again, I might have praised, you might have praised, he might have praised, etc. All right, now here we go. Now what about the passive voice? Well, again, we use the fourth principal part, laudatus aum. And to that we add the subjunctive form of sum. So laudatus aum sem, laudatus aum sis, laudatus aum sit, etc. Simus, situs, and sent. So that's the perfect. And then for the pluperfect, again, fourth principal part, plus the to be verb infinitive, esse, plus ending. So you end up with laudatus aum essem, laudatus aum esses, laudatus aum esset, etc. So this is how we form the active and passive voice subjunctive mood in the perfect system. You're going to want to practice that. I would practice writing them out. I would just grab some verbs, write them down, and practice conjugating them. You can use the back of your book to check your answers. You can just practice with the paradigm verbs. That would be helpful. Now, let's take a look at our uses of subjunctive. Our list is growing, the ones that we've covered. So far, we've covered the jussive, or the purpose clauses, and the result clauses. And today, we're going to focus in on the indirect questions. Now, we've already studied indirect statements, and they're very similar to indirect questions. It's just that they're questions rather than statements. That's kind of easy there. So let's get a definition of what an indirect question is. An indirect question is a subordinate clause which reports a question indirectly, not via direct quotation. For example, they asked what Gaius was doing. That's an indirect question. That's different than, if you compare it here to a direct question, they asked, comma, what is Gaius doing? That's a direct question. An indirect question is altogether different. It is comparable to an indirect statement. Now, how do we recognize an indirect question? Well, you're going to have a subjunctive verb in the secondary clause, and it's going to be distinguished from other subjunctive clauses as it is introduced by an interrogative word. Previously, we've had purpose and result clauses introducing the secondary clause with ut. But here we're going to introduce the secondary clause with an interrogative word, either quis quid, quid quod, quam, quando, cur ubi unde ute utrum. Basically your why, who, what, how kinds of words that will help us to introduce the question or the indirect question. Now how do we translate this? Well, One more point here. Main verb, of course, just like the indirect statement, will be a verb of mental activity or sense perception. So that's key. So we recognize the indirect question by the main verb being a verb of mental activity, and then a secondary verb that is subjunctive, and that clause is being introduced by an interrogative word. All right. Translation, we're going to translate that subjunctive verb as if it is indicative. So no may or might or anything like that, just straight indicative according to whatever tense that it's in. All right. Now, here's an example. Rogant quid Gaius faciat. We got our main verb in the present tense. They ask. Quid, we have an interrogative word here. They ask what Gaius is doing. Faciat, we have faciat, which is our present tense subjunctive verb in third person singular, active voice, and literally he is doing. So they ask, what is Gaius doing? And this is an interrogative, an indirect question. We're not asking directly what he did. We're indirectly asking. They ask, what is Gaius doing? So you have the verb of mental activity, rogant, followed by a secondary clause introduced by an interrogative. Here we have quid, and then we have our subjunctive verb faciat. Now, just as a quick reminder, as a review here for indirect statements. Remember, indirect statements are statements that are made indirectly by a person. Don't confuse an indirect statement with a direct statement. We've talked about the difference before. But the main thing I want to point out here is the distinction between an indirect statement and an indirect question. The indirect statement, as we learned from chapter 25, and here you have nota bene, remember that indirect statements use infinitives. Here in the indirect questions that we're now learning in chapter 30, indirect questions use a subjunctive verb in the secondary clause. The indirect statements used an infinitive in the secondary clause. So that's an important distinction to make here. And here's that distinction here. Indirect questions use the subjunctive. All right. Now, what about a question that is going to be asked in the future? Sometimes the future active paraphrastic will be employed to ask a question in future. You say, oh my goodness, I thought we were done with the whole paraphrastic. We learned about passive paraphrastics. Well, now we've got a future active paraphrastic, and these will be used to ask questions in the future. We'll look at an example of this here in just a minute. Don't worry, don't panic. It's not going to be that hard. All right, let's make a quick distinction here between the indirect question and the direct question. Let's look at a couple of forms of each of these. For, again, the direct question, it's a question made directly from a person. Here we have two examples of this. What is Gaius doing? Quid Gaius facit? That's a direct question. We also have it if it's in quotation marks, for instance, like they ask, comma, what is Gaius doing? This is a direct question. Rogant quid Gaius facit? These are different than the indirect question, which is a question made indirectly from a person. Here we have they ask what Gaius is doing. Rogant quid Gaius faciat. So again, on this last example here, we have an interrogative question, word, quid, introducing a secondary clause, Gaius, quid Gaius faciat, and we have a subjunctive verb in that secondary clause. And of course, rogant is a verb of mental activity in the main verb. So, quick reminder here: in the direct questions, we'll use verbs in the indicative mood, and indirect questions use verbs that are in the subjunctive mood. So that's a distinction there. All right, we're going to go on to another concept that some people find a little bit tricky. So if you need to take a break, take one now, get a drink of water, and come back. But we're going to discuss sequence of tenses. And it's not terribly difficult, but it's something that's important, and it requires a little bit of focus and concentration. Let's look at sequence of tenses. All right, so when we're using subjunctive verbs, and this applies for all the uses of subjunctive that we've already learned previously as secondary clauses, and the ones that we'll be learning in the coming chapters. So we have two kinds of main verbs. You can see this left column here, the main verb in the main clause. We have primary tenses, which are either present, future, or future perfect. These are actions that are either happening or going to happen in the future. They have not yet happened. So this is our primary tenses. We're going to distinguish that from secondary, or what we call historical tenses. And these are basically everything that's in the past tense: imperfect, perfect, and pluperfect. Now, when you use a subjunctive verb in the secondary clause, which tense is used is dependent on what tense the main verb is. If it is a primary tense, either present, future, or future perfect, then the subjunctive verb must be in the secondary clause. The subjunctive verb needs to be in the present tense if the action is happening at the same time or incomplete. If the action has happened before the action of the main verb, then we'll use the perfect tense subjunctive. Now, if the main verb is a secondary or historical verb, then we will use in the secondary clause the imperfect subjunctive if, again, the action is happening at the same time, or if it's incomplete and will happen in the future as well. So that's the imperfect. But if the action has happened prior to the action of the main verb, we will use the subjunctive pluperfect in the secondary clause. And it'll always be this way. This is not terribly tricky. So just keep in mind, primary tenses will always have present or perfect in the subjunctive clause or secondary clause, and the historical or secondary tenses will always have imperfect or pluperfect. All right, let's look at some examples here. This is an example of a primary tense being used as the main verb, specifically the present tense. We have rogant quando familia mea parveniat. We got two sentences that both use this main verb rogant, present tense, as a primary verb. All right, now let's look at this. We've got our secondary clause being introduced by quando, an interrogative. So we've got quando familia mea parveniat. Notice that parveniat is in a subjunctive verb. We've got that vowel shift, that IA, and it's in the present tense because it's happening at the same time as the main verb. Now, the main verb is in the present tense. It's a primary, so only two choices. It either has to be present or perfect. But since the action is happening at the same time, then we're going to use the present tense. We end up with the translation, they ask, rogant, they ask quando, when. They ask when my family arrives, familia mea parveniat. Now notice we're translating the present tense subjunctive here as an indicative present tense. It's happening at the same time. Now let's compare this to the next example here, quando familia mea parvenierit. Notice that the subjunctive verb here in the secondary clause is in the perfect tense. We have the third principal part plus eri plus the ending, so that gives us our perfect tense subjunctive. And so this is indicating that the action has happened prior to the main verb. We end up with the translation, they ask when my family arrived. The arriving happened before the asking of the question. So they asked when my family arrived. So again, there's only two choices here. It's either going to be present tense if it's happening at the same time, or it's going to be perfect tense if it's happened prior to. So only two choices if our main verb is a primary verb, in this case, present tense. If it had been a future or future perfect, it would have been the exact same thing, either present tense or perfect tense in the secondary verb. Now let's shift this to the main verb being a historical or secondary tense. Specifically here, we're going to use the perfect tense verb, perfect tense form of rogo, so rogavimus. I can't talk today. Rogavimus. There we go. And both examples are going to have that. And we got our secondary clause, cur hoc faceris. And our secondary verb here is going to be in the imperfect tense because it's happening at the same time. Even though the action happened in the past, this secondary verb is action that's happening at the same time in the past. So we're going to use the imperfect. We end up with the translation, we asked, rogavimus, we asked why, cur, you did this. Why you did this. Now we're going to compare that to cur hoc fecesis. Here we have the pluperfect subjunctive verb because the action has happened prior to the asking, which is also in the past. So we have to use the pluperfect form. We end up with, we asked why you had done this, because again, this is a pluperfect verb. Now let's look at one more example of the main verb being in a historical tense, specifically the perfect tense. But this time, what happens if the question is in the future? We asked that just a minute ago. Sometimes the future active periphrastic will be employed to ask a question in the future. Now, if you remember how we formed a passive periphrastic, it was simply the future passive participle plus a form of sum. Well, instead of using the future passive participle, we're going to use the future active participle and again add a form of sum. So let's take a look at this. Here we have rogavemus cur hoc factores esses. And here we have, again, the primary verb is in the historical tense, perfect tense. We have the secondary clause, cur hoc factores esses. And so notice that we're using the imperfect subjunctive of sum esse. Remember, the imperfect is the infinitive plus ending. So we have esses. And we're using the imperfect tense because the main verb is a historical tense. And so we have to use either the imperfect or the pluperfect. Right now, this particular question is indicating action that is happening at the same time as the main verb. So we end up with, there we go, there's our future active periphrastic. Remember the future active participle plus the form of sum. And here's our translation. We asked rogavemus why you will do this, because this is future. So this is how we get around not having a future subjunctive. We have this future active periphrastic. We asked why you will do this. The doing is in the future. And we make use of this periphrastic form. Now, we can use rogamus. We're going to go to present tense. We're going to shift this to a primary tense in the main verb. Cur hoc factores sis. Now again, because the main verb is a primary, we can't use the imperfect. We can't use the pluperfect. We either have to use the present or we have to use the perfect form. Again, this is action happening at the same time. So we're going to use the present subjunctive of sum esse, which is, of course, sim, sis, sit, simus, sit, descent. And so we end up with rogamus cur hoc factores sis. And our translation is we ask, present tense, we ask why you will do this. All right. Now, this is just a simple little chart that I think some of my students find helpful, just to remind you the different principal parts that are used for forming the different tense or systems. So in the indicative mood, we have in the present active, we use the second principal part. We use the present stem, which comes from the second principal part. You just drop the RE, infinitive ending, and it gives you your present stem. For the active perfect system, we use the third principal part. For the passive present, again, we use the second principal part. And for the passive perfect, we use the fourth principal part, or the participial form. So we have this 2, 2, 3, 4 little chart. It's sort of helpful for some people. I want you to see that the subjunctive mood is exactly the same thing. Present active, we use the second principal part. Passive present, we also use the second principal part. Active perfect system, we use the third principal part. And passive perfect, we use the fourth principal part. So they're identical in those forms. All right. Don't forget to study your vocabulary. We will have a quiz later this week. We will discuss this at our next class.